Welcome back to another episode of the Startup Therapy Podcast. This is Ryan Rutan, joined by who else? Wil Schroter, startups.com CEO and founder. So just for context, depending on when you dig this out of your podcast archives, we are still in the middle of COVID-19, in case this is later, and there's another one. God, I hope that's not a thing. COVID-20,
True.
COVID-21.
Agreed.
Okay, so we're in COVID-19, and we're facing the likely onset of a U.S. recession, and so we thought we would spend some time talking about what it's like to build a startup or grow a startup, run a startup during a time of recession. We talk a lot about running startups, but not everybody is old enough to have been through one of these before. So Will, tell us what that's like. I have no idea.
It's our common theme. We're old.
You tell us.
About being old? Yeah.
Right.
Back in my day. So here's there. If you've been in this long enough, you've been through at least two epics. You've been through post 9/11. You've been through post 2007,
Yes.
2008 financial crisis. Again, these are both U.S. Based recessions, and there were many more before that. But what there hadn't really been before those is a startup recession. A lot of people don't think about this, but we really didn't have a startup economy
Yeah, that's right.
until the
Correct.
1990s, not in the way we have it now. And so, VC became particularly big. The rise of small startups, MVPs, all this stuff that kind of changed the game a bit. So again, if you've been doing this long enough in the startup world, you've been through at least two major recessions. And maybe you've been fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to have had to navigate your startup through those recessions. But there's a part that people don't talk about. We all understand the part where going into the recession, kind of the world melts down, right? It's kind of where we are right now. And people are having to let people go and they're losing customers and they're, worried about whether their business will sustain. What a lot of people don't talk to you about, and what I'd love to talk with you today, Ryan, is what do you do to find the opportunities in a recession? See,
Sure.
we've had the opportunity in our lifetimes to actually have gone through the full cycle a few times. So we actually know that there is another side to this, kind of like when the stock market implodes. There's a part where you can buy stock cheaper than you could have ever bought it before
Yeah.
and do really well with that outcome. So while the recession and everything leading into it is always horrible, it's not necessarily the end of days for startups if they really understand the long game.
Absolutely. So let's talk about a few of the aspects that there are obvious downsides to this, right? So we're not saying, "Hey, yay, it's a recession, everybody rejoice." But what we are saying is there are opportunities. You talk about the ability to buy stocks on the cheap, right? There's certainly a lot of that going on right now. Ask real estate investors who were sitting in cash in 2007, 2008, how much fun they had when the housing market started to collapse, and certainly a lot of opportunities there.
Right.
And the analogs are not one to one, but there are a lot of these kind of things that come up in the startup space as well. So let's talk through some of them. What do you think's what's the biggest one for you?
Well, okay, so I think part of it too is I think we can start to use a comparison. This will be helpful for folks that have been building their startups in a good economy to understand some of those big hurdles that we didn't even realize we were dealing with in a good
Yeah.
economy, like trying to find talent, trying to access capital, etc. Actually go away in ways you
Yeah.
wouldn't think of. For example, if heading into prior to the recession, there was tons of competition for what we were doing, right? In this weird one fell swoop, competition goes away. I mean, again, I hate to use this as an example, but look what just happened to Amazon. I mean, Amazon was already eating the lunch of its retail competitors, but overnight, not only did Amazon become more important because of its delivery infrastructure, but all of its competitors literally got shut down. Right? All retail was
Yep.
told to stop
Became
operating.
the option, the only
Yeah.
option.
And so, but look, actually, let's use that because I think it's got a good broad context to it. Sometimes the fastest way to run faster than your competitors is for them to stop running at all. And I think what happens is in a recession, a lot of that competition goes away. And even if it doesn't go away, a lot of it gets horribly distracted, right? Oddly, this is going to sound bizarre. We don't really have a lot of direct competitors at startups.com. We have people that kind of do some of the same things that we do, but we don't have like a one for one competitor, like an Uber Lyft kind of thing. Uh, but if we did, I would be laser focused on how well that competition's leadership was navigating that team through a recession. Because I can tell you, the folks that haven't done it or the folks that aren't good at it get absolutely throttled, which is the fastest way for us to grow outside of our competition. It means all of those customers aren't getting served. It means there's new opportunities there.
Yeah, it was interesting. Without being able to kind of sit on a board meeting or something with another company, there are some interesting indicators that you can pick up on. One of the things I was keyed in on strongly, and of course, is because I handle marketing for us, but I was watching closely marketing of not just our competitors, but other people in the same space, complementary products, and trying to understand at which point they had crossed over into desperation marketing. All right. It
Right.
all started out with
Absolutely.
some, hey, how can we support you through COVID, to 99.9% off COVID sales, right? And
Exactly. Now
and
you
you
see it.
know, right. And so, you can kind of watch this play out. And it was really interesting to see which of the companies kind of got there first, which have never got there. And it was a great indicator, right? Without being able to be a fly on the wall in the boardroom, there were still some really interesting takeaways just from watching how people were communicating, even through their marketing, right? Which you would think you could sort of disguise or mask some of the desperation or the internal struggles, but in this case, some of that came through very, very clear in their marketing messaging. This was interesting to watch.
Well, sure. I mean, think about it too. Like in the middle of a recession, as you're having to make really tough decisions as leadership, and I'm speaking as your competitors in this
Yeah,
case, and you're going to have to lay people off. You're going to have to lose clients, etc. There's nothing internally that's thinking in your mind, let's go play offense, right? People start
right,
to curl up into a ball and they become so internally focused. I mean, think about it when you're growing, you have an internal focus because you want to maintain culture, you want to maintain scalability and infrastructure, et cetera. But it's generally positive stuff.
right.
There's company announcements about how many new people you hired. When it goes the other direction and you start having to let go of people, then all of your focus becomes this quagmire of internal politicking, of just bad morale. It becomes a self-inflicted torrent within the company that sucks all the energy and drive out of the company. It's one of the things, Ryan, that we communicated to our staff at the beginning of all of this is we have to stay focused,
Yes.
because the moment we lose focus, the ship starts going down. And again, to everyone's credit, they've stayed incredibly focused.
Yeah, we've done a great job, I think, and that goes back to the previous episode, which if you didn't listen to, check that out now. I think it dovetails nicely into this one. There's some very, very similar lessons to be taken away from, but with different context. Um, Having that clear communication and staying focused and giving that strong focal point was really important for us, and not trying to go too broad, not saying, hey, let's just keep everything the same as it was, like here's the new context, let's
Right.
focus on this instead. Now let's narrow things down. And I think that that's a big part of, we're talking today about how to uncover these opportunities, what opportunities exist within a recession. If you don't have that focus, or said differently, if all of your focus is turned inward and you're looking at those, the communication breakdowns or the internal strife, you're not going to see the external opportunities. And even if you see them, you're not going to be positioned to execute on them. So you're absolutely right. That internal communication piece, making sure that everybody stays focused, is going to be paramount in terms of creating the situation that allows you to capitalize on these opportunities. So yeah, competition being distracted is a huge one. And
Also, Ryan, it's one of the few times where it actually happens.
right,
I mean, think about it. Up until the recession, or up until like a cataclysmic event like the last few we've been through,
yeah,
all of your competitions focus on taking you out, right?
that's right,
They're focused on
yeah.
taking your customers, sometimes your people, etc. All of a sudden, they're no longer focused on that, right? It's like basically being in the middle of a boxing match, and the person that you're boxing is checking their text messages because there's something's
Yeah,
happening
he
at
just
home.
starts listening to his corner man. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I
what
mean,
do you say?
like,
Yeah. Right, left.
but it's such an interesting opportunity because
Yeah,
at that point, that team is no longer focused. They become easier to defeat. Now, I'm not saying it's all about winning or losing kind of thing, but we do have competition, and this is a unique opportunity in the middle of a recession to capitalize on that different stance. And I think as founders, if we don't do two things, like I mentioned earlier, if we don't rally our team, so we're still focused on the match, so to speak,
Yep.
but also start to pay extra close attention to what's happening with our competitors to see where there might be an opportunity there to kind of get that extra punch in, we're missing. I mean, if we don't recognize how critical this is, so many companies can make dramatic leaps. Again, going back to the Amazon example,
Yep.
just by properly understanding how to execute at the right time.
Yeah.
And this is it.
And it's obviously, there's more to it than just the competition slowing down, quieting down. In my case, one of the things I'm closely tracking is how are the competition spending compared to us, right? If we're looking at our paid marketing
Absolutely.
budgets, how are they spending compared to us, right? And so as we saw spending drop offs, that does open the door for opportunity to spend more.
It does.
But you still need to be careful that like you can still convert, right? If it turns out the reason nobody's spending is because nobody's buying, that's a good signal to take too, right? So
Right.
you do need to, move with caution, right? Sometimes there's a reason that everybody else pulls back.
Right.
So don't get rope-a-doped, going back to the boxing analogy here, and just swing away, and burn all your reserves. But do look for these opportunities. Do keep an eye on the competition and kind of try to evaluate from as many points as you can what's going on around them, and not just what is an opportunity to go after the competition, but what opportunities are going to benefit you most in the long term. Certainly displacement of a competitor, or even just a short-term cash gain by picking up customers that otherwise would have been highly competitive in a paid marketing context or something along those lines. This can be a great opportunity for that. So what else, Will? What else, as
Well,
we
okay, sure. So in good times, everybody and their brother is getting into our market.
yeah,
Everyone's
right.
trying to get headlines. Everyone's on social. Everyone's trying to basically, claim their space and shout out loud. In a recession, everyone gets real quiet.
Yeah.
There's a lot less
Yep.
noise. And if you start to think about how hard we were working in good times to try to break out of that noise through our recruiting, through our customer acquisition, through our press, through our social channels, through every single thing we were
Yes.
doing was so hard because we had so many other voices, not just our competitors, by the way. I just mean in general,
In general.
right? There's
Yep.
just so many people out there, creating content and noise. And all of a sudden, there's a lot less.
I want to key in on something you're saying there, which is noise, and I think I also heard you say the word signal, and I think this is the really important point here, guys. There wasn't necessarily a lot less noise. In fact, in some ways, there was more noise when COVID really started going. All of a sudden, you're getting all these messages about COVID policies. Here's cancellation
Sure.
for Airbnb. This is like, you just started getting flooded, right? So there was a ton of noise, but the noise to signal ratio got so far out of whack that on the rare occasion that something came through that looked like it wasn't COVID related, I was like, oh, please, some of that, whatever that is, I don't even care. At one point, I half jokingly posted on LinkedIn, the next person to market something to me without using COVID as the hook is going to get my money. I didn't even really care what it was. It was just, please send me something with some signal to it. And so
Yeah,
I think
yeah, yeah.
that's
Agreed.
something that in something like a recession or in the crisis that we're in now, it's really, really important to think about how you can dial in that signal to noise ratio, how you can be a bit more focused in terms of what you're delivering, and make sure that it's actually going to resonate with the people that are listening to it, because there is so much noise around this right now, and there's so much information and misinformation that sometimes all it takes is just not going that same direction as everybody else, going against the grain a little bit, just standing out a tiny bit, and thinking about the ways in which you do that. What's going to resonate with folks now? What do they actually need? Right? I don't need one more reminder that this is a big disaster and that people's businesses are struggling, and that of course you're there to help me in any way you can, as long as that means clicking on the link in your email and buying something from you.
Sure.
Right. So I think this is a good time to kind of dial up the empathy, dial back the sales rhetoric, and think about how can we actually get through to people right now, and what will be meaningful for them.
Yeah, you said dial up the empathy. What do people care about right now? Okay,
Yeah.
so 6 months ago, let's say, I was competing with lots of other messages. I was competing with a message that says we're the best place to work. I was competing with a message that says we've got the best product. I was competing with a message that says we have the best content. Follow our social, whatever. Now, because my competition is dramatically more focused, if they're even going to be around at all, if I just start isolating my message to your point of signal, and I start saying, "Hey, we're hiring."
Yeah.
By the way, maybe we're not hiring a ton. Maybe we just let go of a bunch of people, right? I mean, again, obviously in a recession, things aren't going particularly well, and we're not necessarily hiring a ton of people. But how many people that we couldn't talk to before might be open to a conversation now, right?
Right.
Whether they're partners, whether they're clients, whether whatever. Um, when when the recession hit, after 9/11 in the US, we lost clients at an epic rate, right? It was just unbelievable.
Yes. Yeah.
But at some point I started to think about it. I'm like, well, so is our competition. And those clients have to go somewhere. In other words,
Yeah.
we worked with major brands like BMW and Best Buy and stuff like that. And I thought, if we're losing clients, it means other people are losing clients. And if they're losing clients, those clients are going to have to, those are conversations that I would never been able to get before. Agency of record
Right.
opportunities. Let me go call on those folks. Right. And maybe there's no opportunity today, but no one else is calling on them because everybody else is worried about losing all their clients.
Right.
There was just a bunch of counter strategies that I started to learn that when everyone's running away, there is some opportunity in running toward because nobody else is doing it, right? And I think if we zoom out a bit and we start to really think critically about the landscape, about everything that just changed, and stop thinking entirely about defense and just saying, "Oh, okay, we got to spend less on this or cut this
Yeah.
expense, etc." And say, "Okay, we're going to do all that by all means. We're going to circle the wagons and play defense." But then what? What does offense look like? Where are the new counter punches that we can start to land that no one else is thinking of? I think for folks, Ryan, I think for folks who have never been through this before, it's hard to think about anything but defense, right? Again,
It
I don't
is.
want to underplay that. It's
Watching
really hard.
clients leak out the door, watching your MRR numbers trend down and trend down, getting closer and
Yep.
closer to, kind of hitting the red in terms of the cash flows, or going further into the red, depending on kind of where you are in the life cycle of the company. Uh, those things all do require focus, right? And there may be circumstances in your business that don't allow you to play as much offense, but at some point you have to turn the corner on that, right? There's no version of cost cutting that grows the company long term, right? You can play defense
Right.
all you want. At some point, you got to turn the offense back on, and I think that's probably the part of this that is as much art as science, is knowing when those times are, like when to get aggressive with the marketing again. And there are strategies around that, right? We've been deploying that for the last couple of months, where we cut back budgets. And then you push a little harder time to time, and you see, do the conversions hold? Do clicks stay where we want them to be? And there's a strategy around that, right? But obviously, depending on what your situation is, there may be more defense required, right? You may not be in a position where you've got any cash to spend, right? You're going cash negative. In those cases, it's tough. What are some things you can think of, Will? I've got a couple in mind. And you've
Sure.
touched on some of them already, in terms of clients going into the wind from other competitors, people you can pick up more easily. And I think there is a big difference too between a big company and a startup company too. And I think there are
Right.
different opportunities for them, right? Because a small company may be able to afford to be more nimble, or take on a project that is so small for a larger competitor that it just wouldn't be economically feasible or worthwhile. And so I think that at times where your ability to grow is severely hindered by an economic recession, you need to think about what are the unique capabilities of your particular company, right? And again, if you're small and nimble, maybe that means being able to go after some larger clients you wouldn't have been able to get to before, whose budgets are now so
Absolutely.
small that their agencies don't want to work with them,
Right.
right? Or things like if you've got a more flexible staffing line, for example, big companies with a ton of fixed salary overheads don't have a lot of options, right? In terms of what they can do legally, how they can even just ethically, how do we ride through this? A very small company, one that's largely contractor driven, or relies on service providers to fill in some of those things that would traditionally be overheads, can leave you in a really interesting and beneficial position. So I think it's always worth turning the lens back around and saying, okay, what about this situation can be perceived as beneficial for us, right? So are we more nimble, or are we so conservative that we've always sat on cash, which has limited our growth in the past, but now leaves us in a cash flush position, right?
Well, let's talk about
Probably
that.
not the case for a ton of people, but it's an option, right? And it can happen.
Well, let's talk about you know, what our cash can buy us, because I think
Yeah.
that leads us to the next logical thing is the world's about to go on sale.
Yes,
And if you've
exactly.
never been in a startup when the world goes on sale, it's awesome.
Yes.
Because, similar to the noise issue, all the things that we were spending so much money on all of a sudden become awfully cheap
Yes.
in a way that it fundamentally changes the economics of our business, forcing us to actually rethink what could this business be given these new economics. And I'll give
Right.
you just really a life changing example that I went through. Uh, Post 9/11 or leading up to 9/11, it's the go 90s, it's the dot com boom, all those things. Everything was bananas expensive.
Yes.
Everything, right? Office space, people, like I'll never forget.
Even hosting. Do you remember we used to pay for hosting?
Oh my god, right? Hosting, marketing. I mean, literally everything you could come up with
Yeah.
was crazy expensive. Like as expensive as it's ever been. And one of the things I thought about when everything kind of went south was, well, boy, like where's all this stuff going to go? In other words,
Right.
if if uh if magazines at the time were selling every ad up until the bust, they still have to sell ads, but now no one's going to buy them. So I wonder what
Right.
an ad costs these days, right?
A lot less.
Or uh, so much less, right? Or hosting, or office space, or I mean, people, you name it, everything all of a sudden becomes a fraction of the price. Also, definitely worth noting, everything becomes renegotiable. Your office lease, your
Yes.
contractor
It's a
contracts,
huge one. It's not just new things you're going to go buy, right? It's everything you're already paying
everything gets
for.
repriced.
Yeah.
And so what happened was, like, up until, call it, like 2001, 2002, if you wanted to do a startup, and mind you, the world was very different, not just because of the 90s, but because of cost structures. We didn't have MVPs yet, all this other stuff. Um, but if you wanted to start a startup, you actually did need millions of dollars. There was no way around it.
Right.
You couldn't start it on your credit card, so to speak, in most cases, because media was different. There was no performance marketing yet. You couldn't buy per click. You had to just buy a giant spot and hope somebody clicked. Um, and so you didn't have nearly the freelance marketplaces, the gig economies, all these things you can tap into. But that's where this started. That's where all of this started to come to fruition. And as I was exiting the agency, I was starting to look at all of these different things that were coming down in cost, hosting, performance marketing, all of these things. And I started to have a little bit of a light bulb moment. And I said, well, if all this stuff is cheaper, what kind of businesses could I build in the wake of everything being a fraction of the cost?
Yeah.
And for me, that turned into, an incubator where I started to build SaaS-based businesses at a time when those weren't really a thing yet, not at a small scale. And it was awesome. I could fund a company on my credit card that would have cost me millions of dollars a year prior. I mean, think about that delta in that opportunity, and that was the dawn of like Web 2.0 and all of that stuff.
Right. And I mean, it was that reduction in cost that I think allowed a lot more entrance into the market, which is what really put startups on the map in a much bigger way. Got them outside their traditional geographic boundaries. Traditional meaning, like the 7 or 8 years prior to that, because as you said, they don't go back that far into history, not in the sense that we
Right.
think of them now. And yeah, I think that was, yeah. So again, there are opportunities to be had, and that was one that was less of an opportunity and just more of a global change that opened the door for future entrepreneurship. Right? Had we not gone through, the 9/11 disaster and the subsequent recession. Who knows? I mean, that as strange as that is to think about, that may have set startups back 7, 8, 10 years.
Yeah,
Because if things hadn't gotten repriced, if things had stayed where they were, and it could have even cemented the system into something quite different than it is now. It may not have evolved at
absolutely.
all. It may have stayed in that position because if a couple of big breakout businesses had occurred, kind of minting a couple of VCs. And consolidating that power more than it is now, that could have dramatically changed the landscape permanently, which is it's fascinating to think about.
Absolutely. And so if you go through your progression, and by progression, I mean you just walk down your P&L and you say, "Hey," your income statement, say, "Hey, everything on this list should be repriced right now.
Yeah.
I'm going to make the exception of employees because
Right.
I don't want to say reprice the salaries you pay people. You may have to, by the way, whether you want to or not. But I'm specifically talking about all the other costs. If we look at our office space, I mean, Ryan, think about what's about to happen in commercial
Yes.
office space right now.
Oh my. Wait. What's commercial office space? What's that?
Right. No, what's about to happen in commercial office space is essentially what happened post 9/11, where all of a
Yeah.
sudden it just never came back. Right.
Yep.
Once you had post 9/11, you had the entry of performance marketing, particular PPC, and traditional marketing never recovered from that.
Just
Right.
never came
The
back. Yeah.
internet kind of took over because it became more cost effective, et cetera.
Yep.
We're seeing the same thing now with office space, where we just canceled our office lease. We've had the same we've been in the same building for 10 years,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden, mind you, we're mostly work from home, but we were like, just don't need it anymore. And I've got to
Just
imagine
don't need them.
if we didn't need it, a lot of other people who are doing layoffs and you're really trying to shred costs hardcore, whether they need it or not, aren't going to pay for it. Not to mention retailers that have been put out of business, so on and so forth.
Yeah. The commercial space is about to get very, very interesting.
Yeah, and then the banks behind them and everything else like that. But I guess my point there is, if we go through the progression, we look at every line item on our income statement, and we start to say, could this be renegotiated, or what does the world look like now versus when we bought this service?
Yeah.
If this was circa 2001 ish, 2002, and I started to go through that same progression, I would say I'd start with the media budget. I was like, man, we're running ads on Yahoo. I think that's the thing. We're running our
Right.
banner ads on Yahoo. We're in Fast Company. We're in, we're all these different journals.
We're on highway billboards, right? I mean, it sounds ludicrous, but that was part of a media budget. Yeah.
Yeah, let's kill all that. Let's move everything to online, which is essentially what I did. But Uh, we then look at all the contractors we were working with, our recruiters' fees that we were paying, our accounting fees that we were paying. We look at
Yep.
everything and say everything gets repriced. And the truth is, everyone else is repricing stuff too. Your clients are repricing you as well. So
Yes, of course.
if you don't adjust your stock with everybody else's stock, you're in a tough spot. And so the other side of it is you can start to say, when things were so expensive, we kind of had a relative measure in our minds of what a cost of goods sold look like. And I don't just mean the traditional COGS where you're saying, here's the manufactured cost of this product, but just in general, like our OPEX, like what it took to run this business. Maybe this
Right.
is a way more profitable business if we're 33% down in total sales, but 50% down in total OPEX, right?
Right.
And so
Yep.
I think looking at the business, not just today, because we're trying to cut costs to match up with what just happened, but also looking 1, 2, 3 years down the road and say, what does V2 of this business model look like now that the world has changed so much?
Yeah, that's a great point, Will. I mean, we have to at some point turn the corner and start to be a little more forward facing, right? We got to start to think longitudinally. We got to start to think down the line. In as much as we're repricing, products and vendors and all the things that we're using, I think there's something else that's important that we do, which is to kind of reprice and maybe reset our baselines in terms of what does this business look like, right? It's not a temporary situation in which we say, okay, weather the storm and then reemerge 2 years from now and we're just back to being the same business we were. Like we said with the agency world, it changed in 2000, in the early 2000s, and it never went back, right? Things didn't go back to being what they were before that.
Absolutely.
And so you have to consider what the long-term outcomes there are and how does the business fundamentally change over that next 2, 3, 4 years.
I think people have a hard time, particularly founders, but really even the entire staff, understanding that not every business has a straight line trajectory, right? And fundamentally, they can. I mean, if you
Very
look at
few
stock
do.
prices over decades, right? What's
Yeah.
that?
I said very few do, in fact.
Yeah, very few do. And what I mean by that is, especially among startups, there's nothing wrong with a startup hitting peak and then valley and then peak and then valley. By the way, it sucks, right? There's no
Yeah.
version when I say nothing wrong, like it's not painful. What I'm saying is, if we were killing it, let's say we became a $7 million business at our peak before the before COVID, and post COVID we become a $3 million business.
Yeah.
If our mentality continues to be, why aren't we a $7 million business anymore? we failed.
Yep.
That's the equivalent of saying we lost the last game. Why don't we have that same score now, or why are we not improving it? And the truth is that game's over. You lost, right?
Yep.
Let's focus on the next
That's
game,
exactly it.
right?
Yep. What is the best version of the business we can be in the new context? Right. That's what your mindset needs to be.
Absolutely. And I think the longer we try to hold on to the conditions of the past, and this is the biggest mistake from big companies to small. So long as we keep trying to recreate the past, which is all of retail for the last 10 or 20 years, all of media for the last 10 or 20 years,
Oh my goodness. Yep.
we will fail. The only way that we can truly rebuild this thing and put ourselves back on a growth arc is to reset the chains and say, okay, at this point, we're a $3 million company. Let's be a badass $3 million company. As a $3 million company, here's what OpEx looks like. Here's what revenue looks like. Here's what competition looks like now. Here's what all of our vendor costs look like now. Let's just reset the entire board, right? And stop talking about what happened last month or last year and focus 100% on what the new growth plan looks like. I don't, I just, I don't see a lot of startups doing that. I don't see a lot of public companies doing that. Because especially public companies, they're so hung up on last year's stock price or last quarter's stock price. I think
Yeah.
right now, if every startup, if every founder were just to dig deep and say, what's past is past, what does present look like? I think, I don't know, Ryan, you tell me, I think the opportunities would become far more vast if people just recalibrated properly.
I think they are. Even just mentally and emotionally, the way it changes how you feel about the situation. I think that, to your point, if you're just looking back at the past, if you're the guy who's just recounting that one touchdown he scored in high school over and over and
Exactly.
over again and just wishing that was the moment for the rest of his life, that sounds pathetic, right?
Right.
It's the same thing with your startup, and it's a little bit harder to recognize, and there's probably some version of sunk cost fallacy at play here where you're saying, damn, it was so hard to get to where we were. We worked, our fingers to the bone and late nights and all that. And we invested. We finally got to that $7 million rate, and now we're back to three. Like, how can that be? How can that be? And there's not much you can say to really create comfort in that situation, other than maybe, well, remember that competitor of yours that's no longer even around at all? Makes you feel better, right? Not really. I mean, the relative measuring stick very rarely actually makes you feel any better. But it's the case that if you dwell on that, right, and you think about how that business was in that context, um, you know, hindsight being what it is, of course, it was better to be a $7 million business, just based on the pure math of the thing, but not necessarily, right? And we can probably pull some examples together of businesses that became a better business after leaning down a bit. I think about companies like Basecamp, right? Basecamp went far broader. Now, it wasn't a recession that caused that, but they built out a bunch of other products that turned out not to be core to what their users wanted. And at some point, they pared that back and they became a better business. They're now a
Right.
bigger and financially stronger business based on having cut back what they were doing. So smaller does not necessarily mean worse, and less revenue doesn't necessarily mean less wealth for the founder either. That's something else really important to think about. Sometimes being forced to go through one of these situations where you say, like, hey, how were we spending all that money, right? At
Right.
$7
Absolutely.
million, right? If I was only putting, 4 or 500K in the bank each year based on a $7 million run rate, and I can do the same thing at a $3 million, what did I actually lose, right? I didn't lose anything from a founder wealth standpoint. I'm still paying my people. We're still providing good service to the clients. At some point, you've got to lean back and say, the metrics are important in the context in which they were created, and not after that, right? They
Right.
don't matter anymore. If the situation changes completely, the validity of those metrics, the value of those metrics changes completely with the context.
Right. Absolutely. And I got to tell you, I think the faster that we reset our own mindset more than anything, but certainly that of the team and kind of, investors and everybody else that might be
100%.
involved in the company, the faster we put ourselves on the right trajectory. And again, I'm going to go back to this, how we're operating in the midst of how everyone else is operating. If Ryan, if we have our shit together right now, if we stay focused, if we stay positive to the extent that we can, if we keep everything going like in a push forward direction, even though the world is pushing back,
Yeah.
that makes us so much stronger because everyone else is retreating, right? And that's the essence of what we're talking about here, Ryan. I think at what point as a business, we can determine what our future is going to be, what the present exists, like in a realistic sense, and can focus on nothing but, okay, let's grow from here. We're 100x further ahead than everyone around us. And I think that's the core of the opportunity here.
Yeah, I would take this a step further and say there's not really a wrong time to do that, right? I think
Right.
that you're forced into these situations or into that type of reflection because of external situations. But is there really a wrong time to think about your business in that way and to make sure that you're kind of constantly recontextualizing, understanding the current situation? It's certainly in my case, and I think this is true of a lot of entrepreneurs that I know, we can get pretty myopic and we can put blinders on. We can go heads down and just keep plowing away. And sometimes it's exactly what we need to do, but oftentimes there's a cost to that. We've talked about it in the context of moving too fast, right? If you're growing really fast, you may miss an appropriate turn or pivot simply because your head's down and focused on a particular type of growth. Same thing, even in a stable and mature business, and maybe even more so, you don't think about the need to optimize. You don't think about the need to kind of reset baselines because it's working well enough, right? And sometimes that can bring huge costs to the overall health of the business because you're not forced into looking at some of the underlying factors that could be holding you back.
There's another piece to that, which I always think is fascinating. Whatever the business has to strip down and rebuild, it almost never rebuilds the same way, which there's a
Yes,
lot to be said for that, right? I've been
right.
watching major companies like Uber and Airbnb and all these folks lay off massive amounts of people, right? I mean, here are these darling businesses, billion-dollar businesses, et cetera, just laying off people in the droves, right? Unprecedented
Yep,
numbers. By the way, it's not their fault. I mean, literally the whole world shut down. But my point is, there's no version where they're going to say, "Look, when things get better, we're going to hire every single one of those people back. We're going to,
that's right.
start up every single one of those initiatives. We're going to start, that never happens. It never happens because maybe those weren't the people you were supposed to really have to begin with, right? Maybe those weren't
Right.
that wasn't the cost structure. Maybe, there's an infinite amount of things where resetting and restarting is sometimes the healthiest thing you can do long term, and it actually allows you to build the business in a proper context, not just because there's a recession, but because now who you should have hired and where you should have gone when you go to build a business again.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think some of that's driven by the fact that when we're making decisions in the normal course of business, right? So outside of a crisis, outside of a recession, we're often building kind of bottom up, right, towards a strategic goal, but we're building bottom up. New costs tend to come from downstream. Somebody needs a new machine, somebody needs more marketing spend, somebody needs something, right? And we tend to look at those in a fairly siloed fashion, right? We look at those and we say, okay, what is the value of this thing that's being proposed? Does that make sense in the current context? And yes, right. 2 months later, that context may be totally different. And if it wasn't considered sort of in a global sense, then when you're forced to look at these things in a recession, in some moment of crisis, we tend to look top down, right? We tend to say like, okay, what's most important right now? All right, which we are rarely forced to consider. I think good leaders do, but I don't think that everybody always does that. When we're forced to do that and look top down, I think that it puts it into that broader context. We get out of the silos, we get out of the vacuum decision making, and we say, okay, of all the things, we got to cut a bunch of stuff, or we got to clean up a bunch of things, we got to reduce spend, we got to do whatever. You look at that in a more global way when you're forced into it, as opposed to, okay, we want to increase marketing spend by 15% next month. We don't necessarily look at how that threads through the entire organization when we're making that decision in the course of normal business, which is an interesting insight, right? Maybe we should start to do more of that, but that can be tough too, right? Because you can sort of endlessly analyze, and that leads to paralysis. But I think that in the right context and given the appropriate attention, things like a recession, things like a crisis can be really healthy for the business. If nothing else, it rings that bell that says, hey, pay attention to everything right now. Let's go back through it, let's reset, and let's figure out how we move forward from here.